Well, hello and welcome to another Faith, Philosophy and Life with me, Mr. Shelton. It's great to see you and I hope you're doing well. We're doing a unit called Good and Evil at the moment, and we have been thinking about what evil is and what suffering is. And today we're going to be thinking a little bit more about where evil and suffering comes from and why it is actually a big issue for Christians. But before we get into that, have a quick look at these three questions here. Pause me now and try and see if you can think of what the answers are. Okay, so privation is where something is held back from. So darkness is the privation of light. Evil might be classed as the privation of good. It's the absence of something. Genesis 2 tells us about the creation of Adam and Eve. Genesis 3 tells us about the fall. And and then the final question is the idea that if God is the omnis, why is it that suffering still happens? And we're going to explore that some more today. What I'd like you to do is to go and grab your pen and your paper, because here's our cheesy intro music. So the next thing I'd like you to do is, it says do it on post-it notes, but you don't need to, I'm quite flexible with that, is I'd like you to look at these 6 questions at the bottom. I'd like you to choose 3 of them and just to write down a little response that you might have to those. So choose 3 of those questions, they could be the white or the grey ones underneath, and then explain what you think about that just in 1 sentence each. Then come back to me. Beautiful. So our title today is How Can God Exist If People Suffer? And today we're going to explore how Christians try to resolve theodicy. Theodicy is just a posh term to try and say how Christians try and sort the problem of evil and suffering out. It's going to be a good outcome if you can say how some Christians may respond to the issue of evil and suffering. It's going to be great if you can apply responses to the problem of evil into an evaluative piece of writing, and even better if you can compare some different views of God and how those views of God may excuse God from evil. As usual, can I remind you to make sure that everything that you do today is photographed and sent through to your teachers, because we're a bit nosy like that and we want to check that you have understood what it is that we're doing. So we've looked at some big questions today. We're going to think about what God is like. There's a couple of media clips, an exam question, and then an if activity as well. So to start off with, I'd like you to think about this question. Okay, what do we understand by God? Okay, what do Christians believe God is like? So pause me now and write down some ideas of what Christians might think about God. Okay, so these are some of the things that Christians might think about. God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, creator, judge, lawgiver. There's loads of them. But the problem is that evil still exists. I want to give you a daft example of this. So this is a picture of my son when he was absolutely tiny. He was smaller than this in the story that I'm about to give you, but he had been bought one of these big helium balloons, which you can see there, that looks like a fish. Now I want you to imagine that I am in the kitchen making a cup of tea, and my son is going towards a fireplace where there's a marble hearth at the bottom of it. He has his first little tooth that's through and he's crawling around, and he does what every toddler do. He pulls the string down of the balloon so it's bobbing around, and he tries to put his mouth around it. So there's his little tooth about to pop the balloon. Now, I love my son. I would rescue him if I could, but I'm not there. You'd understand why the balloon would pop. You might say I was a bit negligent in making a cup of tea and leaving him by himself. And I suppose that's a fair point. However, the point remains that you'd understand, because I didn't know it was happening, why he might hurt himself. Now, imagine for a second then that I had some disability, that I was physically unable to raise the alarm or rescue him. So I was sat on the sofa. I couldn't see it happening. I wasn't powerful, but I loved him anyway. Well, you'd understand why the balloon would pop. Now, imagine that I removed love. Imagine that I just didn't love him. I was sat on the sofa, I was drinking a cup of tea, I could have quite easily got off, I was powerful enough to, but actually I chose not to. You'd say I was very cruel, but I wouldn't care about that because I don't love him. Now, the thing is, at that point, that you can call me whatever names you want, but it makes no difference because I don't love him. Now, the problem remains, though, that if I claim that I love him, if I can see it happening, and if I'm powerful enough to rescue him, why would I stay sat on the sofa? So pause me now and come up with some reasons as to why I might choose not to help him out. Okay, now that's exactly what the logical problem of evil is from a Christian perspective. God are all those three things, yet he chooses not to intervene, and I wonder why that is. So, we're now going to look at some potential responses to that. In the description below, you will find this worksheet. I've got a clip to play from the classic Mr. Macmillan RE, and I'd like you to watch this and complete the questions on the sheet as we go.
Welcome to another revision tutorial from Mr. Macmillan Revise, making revision easier. This is the first part of a series on the problem of evil. This introduction will cover an outline of the problem of evil itself and then some of the general responses to it. What is the problem of evil? The problem of evil, also known as the problem of suffering, is an argument against the existence of God. It claims that the existence of evil and suffering, such as pain, distress, and death, is incompatible with the existence of the classical theist God, who is meant to be all-loving and all-powerful. The Greek philosopher Epicurus gives one of the earliest statements of the problem of evil in what is sometimes called the Epicurean paradox. It's worth quoting and trying to remember it in its entirety. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? The 20th century Australian philosopher John Mackey attempted to demonstrate the problem clearly by reformulating the Epicurean paradox into what he called the Inconsistent Triad. The Inconsistent Triad is a collection of three statements which Mackey claims cannot logically all be true at the same time without leading to a contradiction of some sort. The statements are: 1. God is all good, or benevolent. 2. God is all powerful, or omnipotent. And 3. Evil exists. Mackey's line of reasoning goes as follows. If God is willing to remove all suffering because he is benevolent, and he is able to remove all suffering because he can do anything because he's omnipotent, then surely there should be no evil. But since evil exists, then it must be the case that God doesn't exist. The problem of evil can be found in broadly two different forms. Both Epicurus and Mackey's arguments can be classified as forms of the logical problem of evil. This is a deductive argument which claims to prove that God's existence is logically incompatible with the existence of evil. The second form of the argument is called the evidential problem of evil. One of the key proponents of this form of the argument was William Rowe. This argument differs from the logical problem of evil in that it doesn't claim that God's existence is completely incompatible with the existence of evil, but rather that the existence of evil, and in particular intense or unnecessary suffering, makes God's existence unlikely or improbable. In this sense, the argument is inductive in that it doesn't claim to prove its conclusion. Having said that, most of the exam textbooks still focus on the logical problem of evil as expressed by people like Epicurus and Mackey. So let's have a look at it more closely. This argument is usually expressed as a deductive argument and could be summarised as follows. Premise 1, evil and suffering exist. Premise 2, God is all-powerful and all-loving. Premise 3, an all-loving, all-powerful God, if he existed, would remove evil and suffering. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. This is an example of a deductive argument. This is both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that it means that if the premises are true, then we have to accept the conclusion. However, the disadvantage is that it also means that if we can show that any one of the premises upon which the argument is based is not true, then we have invalidated the argument. Let's now look at each of the premises and judge whether they are open to question. Premise 1. Evil and suffering exists. Although this statement might seem obviously true, some thinkers claim that it is not correct to think of evil as a thing that actually exists. One train of thought suggests that evil is simply the absence of good. Darkness is the name we give to the absence of light. Darkness is not a thing in itself. Silence is the absence of sound. It is not a thing in itself. If evil is simply the absence of good, then it's not a thing in itself, so cannot be said to truly exist. Another train of thought, common in the Eastern religions, is that evil and suffering are human illusions. They are the names we give to situations when our own greedy and selfish motives are not satisfied. Premise 2. God, if he exists, is all-powerful and all-loving. Although theists such as Jews, Christians and Muslims would agree with this statement, there are many people who, despite believing in God, would disagree with this description of him. Deism is the belief in a non-personal God. This being would not have the characteristics of goodness or of being loving, since these are qualities only associated with persons. In Zoroastrianism, which has a dualist view of the universe, God is not seen as omnipotent, and therefore this could be a reason why he does not or cannot prevent evil. Premise 3. An all-good, all-powerful God would remove evil and suffering. This is perhaps the crux of the problem of evil. Most attempts to solve the problem of evil question this assumption that God would want to, or is able to, remove all suffering. Some argue that God does not want to remove suffering because he has legitimate reasons for allowing it to continue. Most commonly, that through suffering God can bring about some higher good. On the other hand, some argue that God simply cannot remove suffering, not because he is not all-powerful, but because it is logically impossible. In other words, trying to have a world with good, but not evil, is like trying to have a world with up, but not down, or light, but not dark. It simply is impossible. These attempts to explain why God chooses not to prevent evil and suffering are called theodicies, and in the other parts of this series I will outline some of the most well-known theodicies. That's the end of part 1 of this series on the problem of evil. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter, and download the podcast from iTunes.
Okay, so David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, said this: the problem of evil is the rock of atheism. Basically, what he means by that is that the thing that underpins atheism, that makes atheism, disbelief in God, so important, is the problem of evil. Because evil is insurmountable, you can't get round it. And therefore, a theodicy is an argument that explains why God allows evil to happen. Could you please just have a quick note of those in your book? What theodicy means and what David Hume says, and then come back to me. Okay, so we said a good outcome would be if you could say how some Christians respond to the problem of evil, and we've looked at that quite a lot so far. Great if you could apply some responses to it to an evaluative piece of writing, and that's what we're going to go to, and then do a little bit about whether God can be excused from evil or not. So this is our D question. It's a farmy question. So it's for, against, rebuttal, my opinion, and if everyone. And the question is this: God can't be all-loving, all-powerful and all-knowing because evil and suffering exist in the world. Okay, so write the question out, 15 minutes. Give yourself a page and a half to respond to that. Remember to use quotes. Look back in some of my previous lessons, the God Jitters quotes. Look at some of the Bible verses that you've looked at in Origins and Meaning. And let's get that on. 15 minutes, then come back to me. Okay, so this is how it's marked. First thing you need to do is identify any quotes. If you've not got quotes, you cannot be scoring above 9 marks. It's as simple as that. Have you explained those quotes? Next thing you need to do is to identify religious terms. So go through now, highlight, underline any terms that you might class as being religious. Okay, and then the final check going through is whether it's poor, whether it's limited, whether it's good, very good, or excellent. It's poor if you've only got a couple of sentences. It's limited if you've only got one-sided arguments. It's good if you've got a for and against. It's very good potentially if you've got a for and against and a rebuttal, and it's excellent if you've got all of that as point, evidence, explanation. So set yourself a target now and then come back to me. So this is our last task for today's session. If I had to explain to someone why there is a God who loves us but evil and suffering exists, I would say because. So I'd like you now just to conclude this. So do yourself a little paragraph there, sum it all up from what we thought about today, and I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much for your time. Take care of yourself, stay safe, wash hands, God bless you. I'll see you soon.